This video is all about ridiculously cheap Xbox One games. I consider myself a collector and I spend an unhealthy amount of time looking up games and how much they cost. But the prices of some games really surprises me, and it's these games that I would like to share with you today. I hear people today talking about retro game collecting being too expensive. Well, my answer is to buy modern games cheap and wait for them to become retro. All you have to do is live long enough. With that being said, I wouldn't recommend anyone buy Xbox One games in the hope that in future they'll become very expensive. This isn't a list of Xbox One games I think will become valuable in the future. Instead, this is a list of cheap games that are worth your time. Good games that for some reason are very cheap, which is good news for gamers or people who just want to play these games. Part of the reason why I wouldn't even recommend collecting for the Xbox One is because technically the game isn't even on the disc. Usually you have to download quite a large portion of the game online. So even though you're buying a physical disc, in most cases the game isn't physically on that disc, which in some ways could go towards explaining why these games have been devalued. With hindsight, the Xbox 360 era was kind of the last truly physical games you could get. Xbox 360 games are pretty cheap too, so I actually do collect them, and I know that even if the server shut down, the game is actually on that disc. But the same can't be said for the Xbox One if it ever becomes unsupported. Plus, if the new consoles come out and they don't have disc trays, your Xbox One discs are basically going to be useless on anything other than the Xbox One. Before I get started on my list proper, let's go through some honourable mentions. And also explain the rules a little bit. What do I mean by ridiculously cheap? Well, I've set a target of below £10, but usually most of these games are coming in around £5. I'm using eBay auctions because that's where I buy a lot of my games. And what I mean by ridiculously cheap is that it's cheap compared to what you could buy these games for on the Xbox store. For example, I regularly see Prey selling for around £3 and roughly around £5 once you pay for postage. Whereas if you try to buy this game through your Xbox, it's £19.99. I haven't actually played Prey yet, so I couldn't really say whether it's a good game, which is why it's just an honourable mention. Another honourable mention is the Resident Evil Origins collection. I couldn't really justify putting this on the list because it's not ridiculously cheap at around £10. The only available bundle on the Xbox store is a deluxe bundle, and it comes in at £32. Or you can buy each of the two games individually for £16. Either way, buying this game on a disc is a third the price of what you'll pay on the Xbox store. I never understood why a digital copy would even cost the same as a physical copy, or why anyone out there given the option would decide to spend the same money on a digital version as opposed to getting a physical disc. Physically producing a game has to cost more money, so if anything, people that buy games digitally should be getting some sort of discount. Either way, if you are a Resident Evil fan, you owe it to yourself to own a copy of Resident Evil Origins Collection. And without further preamble, let's get on to number 10, Homefront: The Revolution. And I know what you're thinking, Homefront: The Revolution is a terrible game, why is it on this list? And you'd be right, this is a terrible game. But it's a terrible game with a good game hidden inside. Homefront has a hidden arcade cabinet that lets you play the first 2 levels of Timesplitters 2. I was going to get Homefront on launch just for that reason, and I'm so glad I held out. In fact, I held out for so long that I got the game for under £5 recently, and I have to say I loved playing Timesplitters on my Xbox One. It's a pretty surreal experience playing this with the Xbox One controller, and I think they've done a great job porting this, and I just hope that we see more of this game on the Xbox One. Well worth the price I paid to mess around in one of my favourite games. Number 9, Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. Although I'm not the biggest fan of this game, and I don't think it's the best in the series, considering how much time and effort went into the game, it's really hard to justify not picking up a copy of this, especially if you're a Metal Gear Solid fan. I think part of the reason why it's so cheap is because the game became free with gold at one point, so probably the market's just been flooded with so many copies that people now no longer need, that there's just no demand for the game anymore. But the good news is that if you missed out on it when it was free, you can easily pick up a cheap copy now. That is, of course, unless you want to go onto the Xbox store and pay £42.50 for it. I'm not making this up, this was taken recently, this isn't an old screenshot. This is what this game actually costs. So £2 on eBay for a physical disc or £42.50 on Xbox, your choice. Number 8, Doom. Another critically acclaimed and well loved game. The new reboot of Doom for some reason is ridiculously cheap. I'm not exactly sure why this is, but it's quite easy to get a copy of this for under £5. I don't think it was ever free with gold or anything, so I can't quite explain this one. But I'm not going to complain, and neither should you, so if you haven't played it yet, definitely worth picking up a copy. Number 7, XCOM 2. This is a game that you can actually get brand new for around £7. XCOM games are kind of niche with a bit of a cult following, and usually these kind of games end up being expensive and hold their value for a long time. For some reason that didn't happen with XCOM 2, and you can easily get a good copy for well under £10. If you're a fan of turn-based games and you played the first XCOM and liked it, I would highly recommend you get the second one. It was one of my favourite games when it first came out, and it's well worth adding to your collection. Number 6, Fallout 4. This game is somewhat divided. Some people actually don't like it. I love it. I thought it was a great game. There's so much replay value here, it's overwhelming. I was genuinely overwhelmed with this game. There was just too much to do. If you're looking for a cheap game to sink a lot of time into, I think Fallout 4 is a good candidate. The amount of exploration in this game is insane. I remember when I first got it, I was exploring some of the small towns, and I would go into a random doorway and spend all night exploring a building. You can really get lost in the moment and just go off on a tangent, not doing even the story. I was actually so overwhelmed I never completed the game. Because when I did play it, I didn't even do the main campaign, I just got distracted by all the other stuff you could do in the game. But like most Xbox One games, it's pretty timeless. I don't think the graphics will ever age that much that I'll not want to play it. So it's a good game to have in my collection that I can always go back to later on. Like most games on this list, I would recommend you spend around £5 on a physical copy, instead of the £20 that you'll pay on the Xbox store. Number 5, Gears of War Remastered. This is a game that was actually pretty cheap even when it first came out, but it really hasn't held its value at all. As a remaster, I think it was highly underrated or underpraised, I'm not sure which. Good remasters often go unsung. It's the really bad remasters that you hear about, and for that reason I think Gears of War didn't really get that much attention. For some reason negative reviews outshine the positive reviews, and maybe it's because Gears of War Remastered didn't do anything groundbreaking. But in my opinion, remastered games shouldn't be groundbreaking. They should just play as the original game but be a little bit more polished. And that's exactly what we get with Gears of War Remastered. I had so much fun with the original game, both online and offline, so it was great to relive that experience and play the online mode all over again on the Xbox One. The thing about online games is the communities tend to die whenever newer games come out, so when these remasters happen it's almost like the game gets a second chance. And it was really fun to be a part of that. Number 4, Alien Isolation. I think this is one of the most underrated games in recent times. Even though it did get praise from sensible websites and people, I did say sensible websites, this game came out at a time where people were crying out for a good Alien game, and also I was personally looking for a new survival horror game. And I think this game delivers both. Until I played this game, I had never seen survival horror done in a first-person game, and in some ways I hoped this would be the spark the industry needed to set off in a whole new series of survival horror games. But Sega announced that they weren't happy with the sales, so I do worry that this game could be a one-off. But if you're looking for a unique horror experience, keep an eye out for an auction of this game because usually it goes quite cheap. Number 3, Warhammer The End Times Vermintide. This is a game that I only actually heard about through Games with Gold, so I got it for free and then went back and actually bought the disc to have in my collection because I noticed that for some reason, even though this is a super niche game, there aren't many physical discs available. For some reason, when those discs do come up on auction, they go for really little to no money. The only way I can explain this is because most people already own it on gold, but it's such a good game that I just had to get a physical copy too. After Doom came out, all first-person shooters were called Doom clones, and the same thing is happening with Left 4 Dead. People would call Vermintide a Left 4 Dead clone, myself included. But really I think what's probably going to happen is Left 4 Dead has just spawned its own genre of games. Vermintide's a 4-player co-op online game where your goal is to get to the end of the level, usually fighting some kind of a boss and hordes of enemies. It's really fast paced and hectic, and sometimes you just can't believe you actually get through some parts, and that's when the game's at its best. I'm a huge fan of the Left 4 Dead series, but in some ways I think Vermintide actually improves on the Left 4 Dead formula. I've always wanted more Left 4 Dead, but I'll probably never get it, and that's another reason that I love Vermintide. Number 2, Rare Replay. If you know me at all, you'll probably have guessed that I was going to put this on the list somewhere. I'm really happy this game is as cheap as it is, because it means I can get a couple of copies of it. It's easily one of my favourite game collections and is pretty much the reason I bought an Xbox One. It's understandable why this game is ridiculously cheap. When it first came out it was only £30 and $30, plus it sold super well. It was one of Rare's best selling games for a long time. And for that reason there's lots of supply but not as much demand anymore. You can easily buy this game for around £5 to £10, but actually recently I was in my local toy shop and I noticed they had the game on sale, brand new for £5. Even though I already have the game, I couldn't resist picking up a copy. It's worth that price just for Perfect Dark alone, not to mention the other Nintendo 64 games on there. The collection itself is actually really well presented and there's lots of little fun things and challenges to do, so I'm glad this game is so easily available and is ridiculously cheap. So the number 1 ridiculously cheap Xbox One game on my list is Call of Duty Modern Warfare Remastered. I feel like this is the world's worst best kept secret, but you can actually get this game ridiculously cheap. Now, like with all the other games, if you go onto the Xbox Live Store, it's going to be really expensive, £34.99. And it's kind of rare to get this game on a disc, so it'll probably set you back about £20 just on its own. Even in that shop that I got Rare Replay for pretty cheap, it was on a reduced price at £17.99. Originally the game cost £30. And this is where the secret comes in. If you buy the Call of Duty Infinity Warfare Legacy Edition, it comes with Call of Duty Modern Warfare Remastered. Now what puts most people off is they read the bottom of the box that says requires content download and they assume that Call of Duty Modern Warfare Remastered is a download only code. But that's not true for the Xbox One. There's no DLC code required or anything like that. Both full games are on the disc. I think the confusion is that both on the PC and the PlayStation 4 it is a code. The game isn't included on the disc. I think probably the fact that it's made by Activision too, people would just assume that there was some loophole that you wouldn't get the full game unless you had a code. I've even seen some listings on eBay like this one where it says no DLC code. In the description of this one, the seller actually said they couldn't guarantee that Modern Warfare was playable because they didn't know if the DLC code was used or not. But the fact is you don't even use a code, you just put the disc in and choose to install Modern Warfare. In fact, when I got my copy, I didn't even install Infinity Warfare. So this is a great way of playing a remaster of a very iconic game. It may have completely ruined the first-person shooter genre for a long time, but there's a good reason for that, and it's that it's a really solid game and well worth it just to play the single player. So that was my list of top 10 cheap Xbox One games that are worth playing. If you think I've missed out any, then please do let me know in the comments. I'm always looking out for new games to pick up, so I would really appreciate it if you would share whatever games that you think are cheap and are well worth playing. Thanks for watching, and please do check out my other top 10 videos, and don't forget to subscribe.